We have an excellent session coming up for you. So I'd like to welcome you to the second edition of the AIQRATE webinar specials, the CXO series. Today's session is going to be presented by Shruti Jaiswal, and she'll be talking about reimagining the HR transformation and the future of work, a new strategic approach. Before we start, I'd like to just talk about a few housekeeping activities. I'd request you all to be on mute so that we do not disturb the others. The format of the session is going to be that Shruti is going to go through her presentation, followed by a Q&A session with Dhanrajani. Followed by, there'll be questions which we'll take from the audience. I'd request you to put all your questions in the Q&A panel or the chat that you have on WebEx, and we will take them up towards the end. I'd like to introduce Shruti. So Shruti Jaiswal is a recognized thought leader associated with the field of talent and leadership for nearly 17 years with multinationals like Intel, Aricent, Thomson Reuters, Genpact, Tata Teleservices, etc. She's a published author of the book, Does Your Net Work? And has also co-authored the book, Innovation Black Book 2020, published by Wiley. Shruti is a neuroscience results certified coach, and outside of her corporate job, she also serves as executive chair at Women Economic Forum Karnataka, ASSOCHAM, and the advisor on the Wiley Innovation Advisory Council. Shruti has been conferred with the title of Times Power Woman, Emerging Thought Leader by Times of India. She has also been recognized as Top 40 Under 40 HR Leaders in India by Jombay and Top 101 Training and Development Minds in India by the World HRD Congress. We're really looking forward to the session, Shruti. I'll hand it over to you right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan. Let me just do a quick audio check. Am I audible and clear?
Loud and clear. Loud and clear.
Good. Good. Thanks. Hi, everyone, and welcome once again. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. So thank you for joining me in this discussion, and I've been looking forward to this, to really talk through this and perhaps also hear some of your interesting questions towards the end and see what's on your mind. I've titled this as HR Evolution in VUCA 4.0, and I'll further ground as to what VUCA 4.0 is. Why have I called it as VUCA 4.0? But just to give you a brief on what I'll cover over the next 20 minutes, where I'll talk through the context of the need for this transformation. So as we reimagine this transformation from an HR standpoint, what does that really mean? What context are we talking about? And why is this VUCA suddenly so important? What are the factors playing into that? So I'll speak through that context, and then I'll briefly cover some implications of that. I can go into detail in any of the areas during the Q&A section, but in my presentation, I'll try and keep it at a high level. Yes.
Shruti, I've joined in from Delhi, and there's just been an earthquake apparently. I didn't feel it because I was listening to you. So I'm going to sign out for a bit and come back. Yeah. Okay. Please carry on. Yeah. Bye.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, VUCA can't get any worse than this. My God, that's terrible. I hope we don't have any other Delhi participants on the call. And please first take care of first things first. All right. With that, let me jump right in. Like I said, I'll cover the context and the implications from an HR standpoint, and we will spend enough time on Q&A. So why have I called it 4.0? So first of all, VUCA is not new. We have been talking about VUCA environment has been volatile in the past as well. It has been uncertain earlier as well. Complexity and ambiguity is not new to us. So what are the key drivers of that? And even if you go back to the timeline of what VUCA, if I'm calling it 4.0 now, what does that mean in the previous context? So I'm calling it 4.0 simply to align it to the context of Industry 4.0 or Smart Factory 4.0. And this is the term I'm guessing all of you would be very familiar with. And very briefly, to set the stage a bit on this, I'm trying to move my slide. Okay. Very quickly, and I'm going to spend just 30 seconds on the slide, but if you look at the transitions that we've been through, so in 18th century, when the first industrial revolution really started, and which is what we call Industry 1.0, that's when the steam engine and basic mechanization started to happen. And as you can imagine, HR was not even at play at all. Nobody felt the need for HR for obvious reasons. And then in the 20th century, when the second industrial revolution came in, we started to enter mass production, scale started to happen. And that's where the need for HR in the form of a very transactional administrative format came in. And that's when HR in different terminologies at that time stepped in. Until that time, we didn't talk about VUCA as much. Not that it did not exist, but of course the scale or the magnitude of that was much lesser for us to be talking about it so explicitly. As we entered 20th century and automation started to happen in mid 20s, the IT boom really came in, and HR really came at the forefront at that time. And you would see, and I'm guessing most of the folks, many folks who are in HR, who are from HR on this call, and even for the folks who are from the business side, you would see HR really have taken a lead in a lot of the important discussions, business-related discussions during that time. VUCA got introduced as a term sometime late 20th century and people became very vocal to talk about it towards the late 20th to now, which is what we call the Industry 4.0, where the complexity suddenly become huge. Automation has gone through the roof, and we're not just talking about automation in terms of using computers and systems, but we are interacting with an integrated systems format. So let's break this down further as to what does this context mean. And I'm switching to next slide. It may take a few seconds for some of you to see the next slide. I move to the next slide, which is the slide titled Quick Scan of VUCA 4.0. So let me paint the picture a bit for you. What does this context really mean? What are the drivers of this context that we as HR need to be mindful of? For whatever number of years I've been in this field, I have always believed, and I always say this, that HR should, and will always be a function of what happens around HR. So we can't be an inside-out function. We have to be an outside-in function. What happens in HR, what we do, our priorities are all determined by what happens in the environment around us, what happens to people around us, what happens in the businesses around us, right? And hence, I'm painting a larger picture, and all of this has huge implications of what it means for HR. So there are three key drivers for this. One is the environment. Second is what's happening on the talent front. And third is technology, which is really one of the biggest pieces at this point. What you see in white bullet are the anchors that are leading to those in these three areas. For example, the environment, and this is not an exhaustive list, but this is pretty strong indicative that is leading to these changes. So our VUCA 4.0 is hugely impacted by what's happening in the environment. Our competition landscape has changed now. What that means is and you would see your companies are no more competing with just your peer set of companies. For example, a cab company or a food chain does not see only a food chain as a competition to itself. You could even have, for example, who knew no food company would have thought that suddenly a cab company like an Uber would give them a competition. So Uber Eats came in. So you're no more competing just with a linear structured set of peer competition. Your competition is 360-degree, left, right, and center, any scales, any shape and size. The competition landscape and the business landscape that we're operating has become really big, very broad, and hence a lot of uncertainty there. The structures are starting to become flatter in organization. Of course, the trend started when GE did that. Initially, one of the big companies to do that, they delayered their organization structure from 22 to about 11 layers, and the trend took off. But the need for this, and it's important you understand why the need for this happened, why organizations are moving towards flatter structures, because this need will only increase further, which is the more the competition increases in the environment, the more you're required to respond faster, make decisions faster with faster time to market. I mean, big product IT companies were left behind simply because of slower decision making, less empowerment in the organization, and hence leading to lower time to market, getting delayed products to the market, and they lost it. Flatter structures are already there. One of the financial services company recently delayered from about 11 layer organization to 5. So it's happening just about everywhere, and you will see this trend picking up even more. The fog, and what I call this a fog, so I've used COVID as an example. I did not want to restrict it only to the COVID-19 situation, but I call this fog because you see this ambiguous layer that is creating a lot of mist around. You can't see what lies beyond that. So it's an environment where a lot of things are unclear. You can't really see. And that's an important driver for this creating that VUCA context for you that we need to be mindful of. And I could dive deeper into that during the Q&A, means for HR, but this is just the fact that our environment will continue to remain uncertain. BCPs can't be suddenly, I'm referring to the business continuity. You can't pick them out and dust them off just when you need them. You would need to take learnings from a situation like COVID and be prepared next time when something like this happens, or something bigger than this maybe when it happens. So when it comes to the fog in the environment, you don't wait for the fog to get lifted. You create your what if scenarios and operate in the fog. So it's a key driver which is adding to uncertainty. And evolving customer expectations. Obviously, what that a simple example of that is because the way the tech advancements are happening, for example, your customer is getting a certain experience from another service provider, which is far more advanced, driven by technology. Your customers would expect the same from you. And as HR, for example, if your customers, your internal or your employees are experiencing technology differently elsewhere, at home, in personal lives, in other companies, as they hear from their peers, they would expect the same at their workplace too. So your customer expectations are evolving. And as HR, we need to be mindful of all that is happening in the environment, because that sets the tone for what starts to happen from a demand standpoint internally in our company. So that's number one. Number two is second key driver is talent. And this is no sequence in order because, but I'm just picking them independent of the sequence. Talent, here are a few things at play from a talent standpoint. Earlier, we haven't spoken about generations as much, but if you look at it today, we are operating roughly already in a 4 to 5 Gen mix environment. And different generations, because they've been raised at different times, different generations, for example, a Gen Y, Gen Z, they're operating a lot more in a virtual tech-driven environment compared to the baby boomers or the less millennial population, for example. So we are dealing with different expectations, different personal preferences. 5 generations at the same time in the workforce is something that needs to be taken note of for HR in terms of the culture we create. And how do you work and how do you manage or lead a workforce like that? I mean, just to put some data to that, I believe one of the research said that we would be, by the end of this year, within India, we would be 70% of our workforce would be just millennials, Gen Y and Z. In fact, India, with the youngest population in the workforce, this number could even go higher than that. Gig economy is the norm. This is not new. In fact, globally, if you see, for example, US. In fact, US and UK have been quite prominent with this. US currently already have 36% of the workforce working like a gig. And gig is where you have, in very simple layman terms, we are talking about workforce operating in flexibility, which gives them multiple sources of income, flexibility of how they want to work, when they want to work, what kind of work they want to do. Employees are expecting that. And this is not just an employee requirement, by the way. Our learnings from COVID-19 is also there. It's an organization's requirement as well to leverage a lot more gig workforce, create gig format jobs so that we don't suddenly have to run into a scenario of layoffs because now the business is not there as much. So gig is not just the need for employees, but it will be the need both for the employee and the business, but a trend to watch out for. India currently, in fact, I'm just using an India example again, but roughly, I think 56% of our new employment is already being generated through a gig format of the workforce. Diversity it is changing. It is no more just about gender. It is LGBTQ plus more and more. What technology is created for our talent is earlier we would treat talent at scale, standard policies for everybody, standard practices and process for everybody. Now that is getting a lot more personalized because technology is able to offer a very personalized experience. So the definition of diversity and inclusion is changing. Another key trend to watch out for. And I always call out, just to clarify, we confuse sometimes diversity and inclusion and we use that term interchangeably, but diversity is just a fact. These are just facts. Diversity are differences. These are facts. Inclusion is what we need to focus on because inclusion is about independent of what those differences are. But inclusion is how do you make all of those differences to work together? Inclusion is what we need to focus on to make that diversity mix work in a productive manner. Career ladder to career lattice. Many of you would have heard of that. And for those who think the term is new, let me help explain this a little further. Um, all these three factors have an interplay. So, for example, in the environment space, I talked about flatter structures. Now, flatter structure, which means when you have lesser layer, for example, you had an employee, an assistant manager, then a mid manager, then a senior manager, you had multiple layers, you could still grow in the ladder, go through promotions, and have a vertical way to grow and stay motivated. But as the organizations become flatter to meet the business requirement faster, you won't be able to offer a career ladder to employees as much. That's number one. That's number one reason for this driver, why the shift from the career ladder is happening. And number two, because your employees, the need for, with more millennials coming into the workforce, the need for empowerment is even higher. They are asking for empowerment even more. Even that needs you to have more flatter structures, which are less bureaucratic and less centralized decision making. So, because of that, one of the shifts that's happening in companies and something that companies should start thinking about is how do you offer growth to people, which is not just a standard career vertical ladder, but is more of a lattice, which means you can move not just upward, but left, right, center, and take different experiences and grow. Learning needs and preferences, the next trend in talent, that is another shift, key driver, because learning needs and preferences is, like I said, from scale to it is getting a lot more personalized through technology. How do you offer learning in a way that makes it more engaging for the workforce of today, for a workforce that is a mix of 5 generations, for a workforce that is mix of such huge differences? Netflix is a very good example, and I always take this example because I feel and the learning today will take the format very soon. It already is taking that shape. Will take the format of how Netflix work as an example, which means it offers you what you want to see, watch, learn just at the time when you want to, in the format that you want. It's engaging, it's bite size, and it's available at your convenience. So learning needs and preferences are changing, something for L&D functions in HR to watch out for. And employee expectations, I talked about it earlier, because the environment is changing, technology is making advancements elsewhere. Your employees have different expectations of the workplace, of the tech experience they get in your organization. Number three, the third trend, which is technology. And with the size of the circle, you could see, and I'm emphasizing this is the biggest shift. This is the one that is really adding to the VUCA 4.0 version. I mean, the number of technologies that are at play, you talk about chatbots, IoT, RPA, there is augmented reality, virtual reality. There is just no dearth of technology and more coming in. And technology is able to offer faster and unbiased experience that is consistent, far more efficient. So the shift to technology now, sooner or later, is inevitable. Something as simple as when you're hiring a candidate hiring experience today depends upon who hired me, who was the recruiter who hired me, and my experience would vary whether I interacted with the recruiter A or recruiter B. But technology can offer a very consistent and seamless experience, which is key. So technology is able to perform and do these tasks a lot better. So why not? The shift will happen. And then third is, this is key, data. And the reason I say this in this term is, as technology is advancing so much, there is a lot more data that is getting generated. And being an HR professional, I'm saying it honestly, the fact that, we've always been held to ransom to the fact that, as HR professionals, you sit on data gold mine, but you don't do anything with it. Trust me, that pressure is only going to go up, because this quantum of data is only increasing by every day. The more technologies you will use, for example, when you bring a chatbot to track your engagement responses, when you bring AI to do predictive analysis during hiring, you're only creating more and more data. So obviously, when you're creating more data, you need to do something with it to drive smarter and more intelligent decisions. So all of this put together, these are some of the key trends to keep an eye on, watch out for. Your organization may not need to create suddenly new processes and strategies around it, but aren't these even part of the conversation today? Something to consider. But that's what is leading to a very volatile, a very uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment around us, which is what is bringing HR back on its toes. I'm switching to next slide. If you have questions, please note them down. We can take them a little later towards the end of the webinar. And okay, so hold on. Yeah, so what does that mean? And I'm on the next slide now, and I hope you're already, if this slide has been transitioned and you can see it. With the context that we talked about, here is, I've called it 5 areas that you see on the graph, which are really emerging areas for HR to pay attention to. And the 5 areas are, as you can see on the slide, workforce planning and recruitment, employee experience, upskilling and reskilling, architecture and career growth, data-driven decisions. These 5 areas will see big shifts. I've already seen them in few organizations right now as we speak, but you will see them shifting. If you haven't already in your organization, you will see a lot more shift coming in that area. And the reason I'm calling these out for you is these are big opportunities to bring those changes and new ideas at play. Let me quickly speak through those right now. So I'll spend about 4 to 5 minutes on this slide. You see the graph. Hold on. Yeah, you see the graph as the talent evolution is happening and as the technology is evolving. The shift towards focus on these 5 areas, at least for next 2 to 3 years, you will see these areas only becoming bigger and more important. Workforce planning and recruitment. Look at this example of COVID-19. I will not only use a technology example, but even from the environment. What happened in COVID? The concept of shared workforce came in. The concept of gig economy is now being talked about a lot. Could we have hired more gig workers versus permanent when we knew that this project was only meant to be with us for 1 year or 2 years? Had we thought about it at that time, we wouldn't be required to lay off employees, and that would have led to better planning for those employees when they knew that this is the only contract period they're with us. So a lot of things will change from an environment standpoint or on how we do workforce planning. And with the advent of tech, already many companies are changing the way they recruit. If you use AI, for example, to simply screen a resume or use a chatbot, you can be 90% more efficient. A simple resume that a manual work would take about 45 minutes to scan could be done in less than 5 minutes by applying AI. So the difference is that fast. And with the returns you get for it, this is going to see a lot of automation happening. And if at all you're thinking about that, does that mean the current jobs go away and do we lose jobs? Well, I don't want to get into that discussion, and who knows, but I strongly believe, and from all that I've read and the data that I've researched on, the current jobs will go away does not mean the jobs will go away. Current jobs will definitely change. They need to be upskilled because leveraging technology leave us with a lot more time to do something that's more important, provide more consulting and advising time to the business, for example. Okay, second area, employee experience. On the slide, you see the second bullet that I've called out, which is employee experience. Now, some of your companies may have already started talking about it. So employee experience is not really a new term. We have talked about employee engagement, but suddenly this term of employee experience, the difference that it makes is you're thinking about experience from a complete hire to retire and even post-exit standpoint. So you're thinking about experience very holistically. And number 2, it has become a lot more important now because of how powerful even the employees have become. It's no more just an employer's market. An employee experience is simply what experience or feeling do you leave an employee with through the entire HR value chain? I'll be happy to go into detail during the Q&A, but just being mindful of time, I'm going through these at a high level right now. Upskilling and reskilling, this will become the norm. If you are in the L&D space, or even if you're not, perhaps work with your L&D partners to think about how do you create a learning culture so that you're not just training people when required. And more than L&D, how do you bring your business up to speed to think about upskilling and reskilling as part of their core job. It is a job of the leader and the manager to think about it proactively versus last minute when they come and pounce on HR to say, hey, now I have this project, now suddenly I need this, or suddenly I need people to be trained on working from home or working remotely, or now I don't know how to lead virtually, so on and so forth. Or the next tech skills. Upskilling and reskilling is a big area. And one of the things that I see organizations are not, or corporates in particular, not doing enough of is we are doing this upskilling and reskilling more on a need basis. It also needs a bit of backward integration. What that means is working with academia, some of the tech institutes, some of the MBA institutes, going back and letting them know what are some of the skills you as corporates require 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years down the line, so that they can make those adjustments in their curriculum now, so that tomorrow when you need that workforce, they have them ready. Currently, the gap is that you suddenly need somebody, you hire somebody from even IIT, but the gap in the curriculum is the person is not exactly ready for the skill that you need, and you end up training the person after bringing them into the workforce. So that's an added dimension of upskilling and reskilling, not just train them or reskill them internally within the company, do partner with the larger ecosystem and the academia to help them shape their curriculum in advance. Architecture and career growth. I talked about this when I was talking about career ladder to career lattice. A quick example of that is talent marketplace. The concept of talent marketplace essentially is you can move around different roles and jobs within company leveraging talent marketplace. And talent marketplace is a very tech-enabled tool. You can internally do that too, but to do this at scale, you have to automate it. You have to leverage technology to do this. I've detailed this a lot more in the book that Samir mentioned about in the Black Book 2020, but I'll be happy to dive deeper if you have questions in this area towards the end of the webinar as well. And data-driven decisions. One thing I feel which can keep HR ahead, really ahead of the business, is your data-driven decisions. Trust me, the amount of data that you have available to you right now is like never before. So that's the power you have. You can let the business see from a people standpoint what they can't see right now. Today, technology, deep learning, machine learning are letting you see through data in an integrated fashion. You can combine your performance management data to hiring data, to attrition, to who would be ready for next role in next 2 years or 3 years. You can do all of that by integrating different data sets versus just a linear data-driven decision. So those are 5 key areas. And how am I doing on time, Rohan?
Speed up a bit.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
So, sure. And here is a quick summary slide, all that I've covered so far. So I spoke about the context. I hope the slide is transitioned for you. I'm showing HR 4.0 in summary. VUCA drivers is what I talked about in the first slide. That leads to the second column. This is just the complete, like a handy slide for you. These are the emerging areas of focus. Because of that, we spoke about it just now in the previous slide. And hence, what are the skills required? I've talked about on the right side, what are those skills? This is, again, not an exhaustive list, but these are things which are top of the list, certainly. People analytics, tech acumen, consulting and advising, design thinking, emotional intelligence, outsider knowledge. I do want to call out 2 in particular here. Tech acumen and outsider knowledge, because these 2 are, from what I've seen in HR, these 2 are still ignored areas. Tech acumen is simply to say that technology is not just for the tech people anymore. Even as an HR function, you don't need to understand technology. You don't need to code, but you must know what a code can offer. You must know, if I'm managing recruitment today, what is the potential in artificial intelligence technology can bring, and how efficient can my function be? It prepares you to prepare for that uncertainty in the future. I always say this: you can't anticipate change, but you can create it by staying ahead and updated on the environment. Talk to some of the startups who are working on creating these toolkits. One of the things I do is I stay in touch with a lot of these tech startups, so I know what are some of the scenarios they're planning for, what could come as an next trend in future. Understand from the technology from the perspective of what it can do. How can your function leverage that more? That's the tech acumen HR functions should be able to build. And the last one, the other thing I wanted to call out is outside knowledge. I can't emphasize this enough, how important it is for you to stay connected to people outside of your teams, functions, and company. Connect to the external market. Know how HR and other companies are thinking about. COVID has brought that need for us, and people are talking a lot more today than they have in the past, but proactively build that outside knowledge. And with that, I'll end my sharing with just to say what HR needs to hold tight on to, independent of what scenario you're in. But for the next 2-3 years, I don't see this changing, which is HR's core job will always be to ensure people are front and center of business decisions. When business is making those decisions, you are able to facilitate those discussions to make sure people are not left behind. And number two, look outside and keep pace with the external environment. And third, like I said, technology is not just for tech. All right, I'll pause with that. I'm done with my active sharing that I had, and I'll throw it back to Rohan. Rohan, over to you.
Thanks, Shruti. I'll very quickly introduce Samir. Samir Dhanrajani is the CEO of AIQRATE Advisory and Consulting. Samir, over to you to take over question and answers.
Thanks, Rohan, and pretty wonderful, thought-provoking, and as usual, it's directly like a practitioner talking about a playbook, which to me doesn't exist today, because as HR professionals, I think the need of the hour is to really look at the VUCA factorials, what you had articulated very well. And I like that analogy, which is about navigating through the fog. I think that's exactly what we are going through, each one of us in our respective sphere of, I would say, work wherever we are. And in a lighter way, I can say one thing. Glad you mentioned about consulting and advisory. At least Rohan, mine and NK job is saved, because I think if everyone needs to be on the automation side, and cyborgs and humanoids will be our by I would say in our arms, then what exactly we would do is something which is, I would say, intriguing. But let me take a couple of questions, Shruti, and we've got some really good, interesting questions which from the audience, and I will relay that to you as well. Linking back to the presentation, what you said, and I'm just trying to extend specifically this aspect, which is now imminent. HR value chain is getting now deconstructed. That's absolutely imminent. It's going to happen. No doubts around that. What, in your view, if we take a view today, the demystification of HR value chain, with the advent of exponential technologies, you talked about AI, AR, VR, blockchain, and the things around RPA. How do you see the new value chain of HR emerging?
One of the things I'd mentioned, and I'll go back to that, which is the focus on employee experience will go up. And that is because of technology that has come in. So the need for that, first of all, has come in because of technology, and that will continue to grow. So what that means, first of all, for the entire HR value chain is to work in a lot more integrated fashion than we have in the past. So if you have HR teams operating in silo, trust me, you're in trouble. If your recruitment doesn't talk to your HR business partners enough, or your HR business partners don't talk to your talent or L&D teams enough, trust me, there is a problem. The need for employee experience is going to become core and more important. That's one. And number two, from a tech standpoint, in fact, I have a framework on employee experience, and I can flash that maybe a bit later. But let me call out the second one. But the second point is from a tech standpoint. So one is the entire HR value chain needs to be a lot more integrated than it has been in the past. People need to talk to each other. Number two, so tech advancement is inevitable. That will happen. But where we go wrong is when we just try and automate. Technology is not meant to automate. Automation can happen. I mean, you can just automate. But technology is meant to improve the experiences. So before you make a decision or think about where do I go automate or you leverage technology, you may want to start with a question, what experience are you trying to improve and for who? Those are two things. I could quickly flash a model on employee experience, which puts some
I
things
think
in
that would be
perspective.
great, Shruti.
Sure. And I'm happy to send it out to people. I mean, if they need, absolutely. I keep a lot of material on open space. But so these are some core elements of thinking of employee experience from pre-hire to post. I've seen companies, for example, who don't think about employee experience only when the employee is with you. Um, One of the FMCG companies, they would send bouquet to the family of the employee who left them some time back, a senior employee, even until next 3 years of the employee having left the company. Imagine the kind of word of mouth you're building then. Imagine the kind of loyalty you're building with this with employees in that scenario. There are three things I do want to highlight from an experience standpoint, and this refers back to your question, Samir, is when we are thinking about employee experience and how do we leverage the HR value chain, employee experience, the maturity phase of that is first is do you offer consistent experiences to employees? And technology has an extremely important role. I shared in one of my examples earlier. The thing with manual intervention is there is inconsistency. As humans, we all have our ways of doing things. Technology brings consistency. Do you offer consistent experiences? That's one. And once your employee experience in your organization has reached a level of consistency, then you think about, okay, now where can I improve? That's your next stage of maturity. And when you get there, you've started to make improvement, your sort of employee experience becomes a norm. Then you think about how do you now, from an employee experience, really differentiate yourself as an employer from others? What do you offer to your employee from an experience standpoint that other employers not? Let me pause. Does that answer, Samir?
Great, great. No, I think this thing around employee experience pyramid. In fact, I think it's a very novel pyramid, and specifically your stress upon having consistent experience. And I think over the, I would say, aspect what you talked about, there have been many conversations that look, you cannot be ad hocish in your what I say, creating that experience for the employees. It cannot be just kind of an approach which is devoid of being consistent and being sustainable. Shruti, why don't you pull down the slide, because then we can have a direct chat, because otherwise it just impedes the whole view. And, the other aspect, and coming straight from your presentation, is, and it's also linked to this period of uncertainty what we are going through, which is the COVID, specifically for the CHROs, talent heads, and the HR leaders. On one aspect, we're talking about the normalcy and getting the business to be up and running fast. But there is a whole viewpoint that beginning of the year, all of us went through a talent mapping strategy. Think around in terms of where in HR, where in talent we need to invest, what strategic areas we need to focus from a talent point of view. Now, you've done a lot of stints and you've been kind of in the forefront of many of these strategic conversations on the talent side. Just a practitioner view, post COVID, and I'm hoping the situation gets to normal very soon. What do you suggest from a new normal in the talent mapping strategies, or from a viewpoint of HR leaders? What are the first few steps they should be doing as part of resurrecting and ensuring that the function of HR gets a jump start?
So even before I jump into a few things, I think that should be top of mind. The first actual advice would be just because things become normal tomorrow, don't go back to your normal strategies that you crafted beginning of the year. They were relevant for that period. They might not fit in or prepare you for the future. So even if the situation looks normal, go back and revisit and review your talent policies or processes that you've created to build high performing teams. Now, really, some of the tips around few things that we may want to consider as people function working closely with the business. One of the learning is, and as you look at your talent strategies, our location dependency has changed. Earlier, for example, and I was talking to one of the senior business leaders in a different company, FMCG world, and he was telling me that how much they were reluctant to move a certain project or business to India initially, because they felt, oh, because it's a remote location, most of my teams are based out of it was in the US, they won't be able to work with them. But Suddenly, now when COVID happened, it all seems doable. So relook at your location dependencies. Maybe what you thought as a barrier earlier is no more. So this might open up your lens, or this might give you a broader lens to how you think about moving and shifting and working with talent. So one is that reduce your relook at your location dependencies, which you may have assumed earlier in your talent mapping. Second is we figured, despite that, we've always had businesses and managers leading remotely, right? Remote teams have always been there as a concept. But the scale of this is huge. Just because we go back to normal and people start coming back to work, but I think we will still have a staggered approach to it. We need to equip our leaders and managers to think about, as you do your talent mapping, are our leaders equipped to lead them virtually? Something that we need to think about to lead that talent rightfully. The other is in your talent mapping strategies, if you continue to want to have high performing teams, what's your upskilling and reskilling plan? Go back, and I do want to still emphasize the part about work with the academia. You would need the skills. I'm telling you, I mean, if I look at the numbers, and I particularly do research in the future of HR from a tech standpoint, we really are not aligned with the skills that they think we need as corporates and what we think we need from academia. So go back to them. And last one, look at your workforce plans. I emphasized this when I was sharing the context. What should your permanent or temporary workforce mix or contingent workforce mix look like? Would that look different now, given what we learned from COVID situation? Could we, like I said, could we leverage a lot more gig format? So relook at your workforce plans. Now we are open to a lot more possibilities given the learnings from COVID-19.
Well, I think these are fascinating views what I talked about, and specifically the point which really touched me, what you said about we're all used to the in-person leadership. I mean, a face leadership, and suddenly you see a virtual, remote kind of a leadership template emerging. And if there are no best practices, there are no frameworks, how do you kind of really create your own leadership's quotient or a style is something what I think the leaders need to figure out. So very true. So Shruti, jumping on, and now I will interlink some of the questions also which are coming, and surfeit of questions are coming in. In fact, you talked about in detail about the gig economy. I think this is where, specifically from an India perspective, there is a lot of talk going. And I've got two questions over there, which from the audience, and I'm directly interlinking both. One, the culture per se of having a gig worker working alongside with a permanent worker and maybe a cyborg in the time to come is something we haven't figured out. Second, senior leadership, management side of the gig workers, are they evolving or they are still at infancy? So I would just throw these two questions interlinked on the gig worker side. Shruti, over to you.
Yeah, I think the observations that you made, Samir, are right on. So first of all, culturally, have we evolved to it? No. Because if you see today's gig data, with the numbers that are known, we are still more gig in more, I don't want to use the term blue collar jobs, but still more there. For example, you would see a lot more gig format in the delivery side, in the cab companies, and so on and so forth. And while we do have big corporates have gig workers, but the numbers are really lean. So culturally, are we ready for it? As India, no, right now, no. But I think the question is less about are we ready for it or not? The question is, how do we get ready for it? Because this is what is going to be the future. And it should be if it isn't. Not just because, like I said, it's a need both for the company and for employee. The second part about are our leaders and managers ready for it? You know, even when we talk about diversity and inclusion, even when a simple, because a mother wants to work part-time, use that gig format to manage the baby, she faces challenges even there, and that's even in most evolved companies, they face those challenges. So we have a long way to get there. And this is not just for India, by the way. This is, if not equally, this is a challenge in other economies too. It's not just an India challenge. So yes, it's a challenge. And that's why when I was saying that we need to think about leading virtually in different scenarios, we absolutely need to shift that mindset. We're not there yet.
You suggest it's like, I mean, should the companies create more gig worker friendly policies and evangelize those? Is that something what you're suggesting?
Yes, and evangelize is the right word you used, because the more you make something known, the more you make something part of the conversation, it starts to feel like the norm. Today, because it is not the norm, that's why it is not as acceptable.
Great, great. So one aspect, and this is a very shift of a gear, Shruti, out here, and you mentioned about in your VUCA chart, the piece around automation. Now, there is a rebalancing of machine and kind of, let's say, humans today. HR is at the forefront in terms of leading this entire endeavor of, one, ensuring that the anxieties of the employees are mitigated, that my job will not be taken by the robots or the cyborgs. Second, it's an ensuing thing of saying, look, my job role, which you rightly said, needs to be enhanced as part of the career lattice or part of the description. And third, there'll be a surfeit of automation which will anyway be driven within the HR value chain. Now, it's a whole lot. And, I think you've done that work in many of the organizations you've been associated. Give us top 3 aspects. What needs to be done, this quintessential quotient of HR and automation in terms of managing this thing for the organization as well as for the employees. And by the way, I'm just linking because two set of questions also came in around this from the audience. So I'm just linking that and throwing it to you, please.
So HR and automation. So I don't know if I can come up with top 3, but let me see what comes really top of my mind. There is good learning from Amazon's success story, right? So, and the learning there is when you have to really create a change, a big change, it has to be a customer-driven change. I'm a strong believer of that. It has to be a customer-driven goal. What that means is when something comes as a push from a customer goal standpoint, the organization has no choice but to make it happen. For example, when Amazon, they made their customer interaction at the front line a self-service one, they didn't have a choice because they wanted to give that real-time experience to the customers based on their demand. Eventually, when they did that, they had to come back and re-engineer all their internal processes. Then they did it very well. So first of all, for HR and tech to really join hands, we have to be clear about what is that goal or what is the experience for our customer that we're shifting, that are changing, and what is the urgency for that to do it now that we're doing it. So that's one thing. We have to be clear on that end goal being driven by our customer. It could be an external customer for HR. It could be an internal employee who could be the customer, but there has to be that clear customer-driven goal. That's one. Number 2, so one of my experiences, and I did call out vocally in my book as well, because I feel that if you would go back and ask a recruiter, and I've spoken to custodians of different roles and I tried to test it out. If you go back and, for example, ask a recruitment head, do you see an opportunity to automate? And it's a very, very simple, and I'm sure most of you would agree. The first thing that person would think about is, oh, I'll have to lose my people. Would that mean? So unless there is a push, that person would say, he or she would say, well, I don't think automation would fully take care of what my people can do right now. We are able to provide a lot more personalized. So there'll be a pushback. My people can provide a lot more personalized experiences. So what I'm saying is, if you bring that idea and go back and ask to the person who's holding that role, who's the custodian of that role, they will be resistant. So let's face it. One of the things which is worth doing is bring a neutral party to make the right recommendation, because they will not have any biases one way or the other when it could be an external advisory.
What do you mean by neutral party? Can you please explain when you say that?
It could be somebody outside of the function within the company, or a consultant. Hire a consultant external to the company, get a consultant, get an advisor who can evaluate your HR value chain and make recommendations. Hey, here are scope for efficiencies. Here is where there is scale to invest on. This is where you get the ROI. And hence, this is where we should invest in tech. So the decision or the recommendation eventually, where do you go use technology, should come from a neutral party and not the custodian of the role. That's number 2. And the third part, because you asked me top 3. So the third would be, which is, I said this earlier, and I can't say this enough. Every time you're making a change, you have to ask yourself, or every time you're making an automation, what experience am I improving and for who? If you don't do that, it will fail.
Wonderful, wonderful. Shruti, I think I wish we had more time, but I would take 2 more questions and we still have time. And I'm trying to interlink because it's all pouring in. You mentioned about tech, and there is a dichotomy today in terms of HR and tech. I think if you look at the whole staggering of the functions from a tech adoption and specifically the new age tech adoption, HR is really kind of, let's say, trailing. And you also mentioned in one of your earlier narrative. Now, the one aspect which I want to link, and these are 2 questions linked together. One, there are a barrage of applications in HR within the organizations. I mean, the HCMs to the Oracle, multiple. In your view, I mean, outside of naming them, are these applications really working? Is there an ROI which is effective for getting the bang for the buck? And second, which is linked, is now you rightly said about, look, we got to have new norms of working from home, remote kind of, let's say, features will kick in. How do you measure the productivity? It's always been a question. Look, now I have my kid to kind of attend. I have maybe this utensils to kind of clean, and then again I have to get back to a client situation. How do companies? And I'm sorry, I'm just building it up, but these are 2 linked questions which came in right after one after another. How do you see that? This is where the role of HR becomes more interesting, and that's what I say. Is it the future of work?
By the way, I love the fact that you brought the second question because I have some strong opinions on that, and I'll talk about that. But let me address the first one. So regarding the tools, while I'm not an expert on any of those tools, but I can clearly tell you, having spoken or connected with a lot of tech startups, I keep talking to generally find out what they're doing. And in my networks, I do have a lot of tech startups too. So a lot of these tools are very good. Workday is like the go-to tool for a lot of people. Oracle offers some of the best HCM solutions. And of course, so does SAP. But they are doing very well in isolation as an isolated product. The challenge today is, and this will continue to be the challenge till organizations complete the transition phase. So we are in a transition phase. So if I try to get the best of Workday, let's say, and I want to move all my applications to Workday, the challenge is that some of my tools will not integrate with Workday. And if the integration doesn't happen between the tools, I don't get the most of them because I can't optimize on the data. My information doesn't free flow easily between systems. So that challenge will remain. So I think the gap is, instead of corporates trying to figure it out, and I in fact 2 months back had a detailed conversation with a tech startup which reached out to me for feedback on their tool, and I said, what you need to help your client is proactively think about the tools that exist, and are you able to offer your tool as a one-stop solution which can integrate and connect with all? And I don't think currently, barring some of these top few, even they are not fully integrated yet, but we need tools which can integrate with all the other systems. That's one. And number two, thinking about the user experience. And the good thing, and I've seen this as a good change, a lot of these tech startups are reaching out to corporates to get their feedback while they are building those tools to understand, do you get the right user experience, so on and so forth. So that shift it's good to see. So that's your first question. Second, about productivity. I know many organizations have changed their mindset about it. While it may not work for organizations that work in shift, what I'm suggesting, it may not work for organizations who work in shift or who have a factory environment. But barring that, we need to measure people on the goals that they achieve. I'm a strong believer of that. You need to track them on their goal. Then it doesn't matter what time that person during work from home went out for lunch, what time that person went out to wash the utensils or play with the child, or it doesn't matter.
But look, one of the rants is the goals keeps on changing because the organizations are going through that whole VUCA side. And in one quarter, if I have a goal, the next quarter, the goal changes because the organization, for whatever reason, is not able to accomplish. Why am I to be blamed? And, it's a merit hike period. So that's when talking about the rants, which actually come on the social media.
One of the good things I've seen, so this needs to be driven by your performance management philosophy. It can't be done at an individual behavior level. The company's performance management philosophy needs to talk about this. What are you measuring people on? You don't measure productivity, not the number of hours somebody, the number of hours. People can manipulate that very easily. It's about, did the person deliver? what he or she was supposed to deliver. So even if the goals are changing, that's a different problem. But that doesn't justify still for you to go and check how many hours the person was productive or not productive. I mean, that's just a wrong problem to go after.
Sure. So let me link, and maybe this is the last one I want to take, and because there have been these two questions around the same. And a conversation about HR would never be over when we talk about these skills, attributes, qualities. One, from a leader perspective, HR leadership perspective, it's a tough time. There's a lot of, I would say, the aspect of chaos going. And with that, resilience will be tested. One, and I'll come to the next question on this particular spectrum. What set of new traits, qualities, attributes the HR leaders need to build?
So barring the skills that I called out in my slide, because those are still skills, I think I'll go back to one thing, which is on the lines of agility. Mm-hmm. And I'll repeat that, which is don't wait for the fog to get lifted. And I'll share, and I see I have quick 2 minutes, so let me share this very small story around that. And you reminded me of it because I had this conversation with a commercial pilot. So I had a flight from Bangalore to Goa. And I had this, and I could clearly relate to what that meant for HR functions today in the VUCA world. So what happened was there was fog forecasted in Goa, but the time that we were supposed to land, it seemed it would be okay. So we still took off. But what happened in Goa, the flight just, the pilot figured that there is still fog and the runway was not clear. So he decided to just hover around for about half an hour in the air. We stayed there. And then he thought, and then he made a decision. He may have built his what if scenarios, right? These are people decisions he was making. He said, maybe I could take a shot. What he did was he tried to land. And by the time he reached closer to the runway, he figured that the fog is still strong enough and the runway is not very clear. He, in response, took an extremely steep takeoff. We didn't even realize that pilot showed urgency without creating panic. Mm-hmm. That was one trait that I noticed. And he took off. And then after we were settled back in the air, he said, we need to go back to Bangalore. He brought us back to Bangalore. And then we waited in the aircraft for about 45 minutes. And then he said, we are okay to go back. Now the fog is clear. And he brought us back to Goa. What I'm saying is, when you hold people responsibilities, I understand that when there is fog, you'll be a lot more cautious of what lies ahead. And when Prime Minister Modi said yesterday, not to get political here, but it's just a simple statement, when he said, "Jaan hai to jahan hai," and then he said, "But jahan hona bhi zaruri hai for jaan to exist." You have to keep the business running. You can't wait for the fog to lift up to operate. Time will run by. The concept of the VUCA world is simple, that if you wait and watch, you'll just be in the waiting. And business has to be there for people also to exist. We can't exist without this economy. They both are interdependent. So we can't wait for the fog to get lifted in HR. And that's what agility means to me. You have to keep moving.
Nice analogy. I think you have a knack of linking a lot of these anecdotes, and I think that's what makes the conversation interesting. And last question, Shruti, because we've run out of the time, and this is something pivotal. We're all trying to figure out the ikigai of our life, purpose. HR today is also coaxing employees to really figure out, look, what's relevant. You mentioned about these aspects about empathy, emotional quotient, things around getting more persuasive, negotiation, conflict management. How do you see this thing from an employee's point of view coming into the mainstream? Because look, there is no guide, there is no playbook, and there is no Robin Sharma today. I mean, those existing, rather the theories have been irrelevant. I mean, whatever, today there is a new playbook. What, in your view, employees should be doing?
Communication.
Ikigai of life, when I talk about, which is linked to the ikigai of their job as well as their professional career as well.
Yeah, I think looking at two-way things. See, first of all, HR can't do everything for employees, but HR has the power to create those processes and policies which makes the, let's say, the managers and leaders do the right thing that they need to do for their employees. Employees must communicate to the leaders and managers. And as you're speaking about it, Samir, it's not just today, but I've been mentoring a few senior women professionals. And I'm surprised by the challenges they come up with simply because they're not comfortable communicating them to their managers and they leave things to assumption. I think sometimes when we need to own our career, and a leader who's in place that I'm reporting to is responsible for it equally too. I should not, as an employee, hesitate in asking to have a career development conversation. I should not hesitate in asking, I need this time off. We need to be unapologetic about our asks from the leaders, managers, or the organizations. I believe both need each other. It's not that the employer needs employees more or employees need employers more. Both equally need each other. And we should be unapologetic about our asks. Employees must go reach out to their leaders and managers. And if not, if they don't listen, you still have HR. And these are things that HR has always been very ethical about. They hold those things confidential. If you reach out, they know how to work it around. I mean, that's top of mind what I can think of, but you really hit the nail on the head. It is a problem. Employees many times are not able to raise that voice.
Wonderful. Create the change you anticipate. And that's the chapter of your particular title, what you wrote about in the Wild Innovation book. I fairly remember that. With that, gentlemen and ladies, in fact, this is Shruti Jaiswal, as we know, unabashed, unbiased, very, very thought-provoking views. And I'm sure in this last 60 minutes, you were able to kind of really capture, look, there is a new playbook of HR which is emerging. This HR is a new transformative HR. It's not a business function. It's a way of our life, which is professional life. And second, the future of work starts today. COVID is the right opportunity. And I think all of us have something today to really contribute, which is how we go about resurrecting not only the careers, but also the organization and our own lives. Thank you so much, Shruti. Really having, you out here is a great opportunity. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Thank you. Bye, everyone, and all the best.
Thanks, Rohan. Thanks, NK. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.